Obviously, yesterday was an extraordinary day, a historical day, lined up with the Woodward book. It is the very public unraveling of this administration, as told by members of this administration. What are the parallels? What are the historical precedents?
Well, they're pretty thin, but they are revealing in terms of when they came out. If you look at the Pentagon Papers and the Johnson administration, but that came out after the Johnson administration. If you look at the remarkable details about Richard Nixon's last days in the White House, where he's talking to the portraits and hoping the portraits don't talk back, and he's asking Henry Kissinger to pray with him on the floor of the Lincoln sitting room, and is having one drink or so and becoming incoherent, telling senators that in 25 minutes I could kill 70 million people with a nuclear strike, which led the Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, to say that any military order had to be countersigned by him. And then you move ahead to President Reagan during the days of Iran-Contra, when Howard Baker was coming in to replace Don Regan as chief of staff. Baker's people were researching the 25th Amendment the weekend before they went in to take over, because they were hearing stories that Ronald Reagan was essentially gaga. They get there and they find him immensely charming and totally in control. Here's the distinction about that catalog of moments of presidential disability and potential White House chaos. We learned about those after the fact. Right. We learned about those in books. We learned about those after the crisis to which they were speaking had passed. The remarkable thing about yesterday is this is a real-time historical trove, and it is not simply a matter of interest, it's a cause for action.
Well, and you know, Mika, what's the most, well, I mean, it's just not a secret. I mean, this is what I think is what's most telling about the Woodward book, what's most telling about this op-ed, is that we've not only been saying this since he's been president of the United States. We said, to much consternation, that Kellyanne Conway would come on this show throughout Donald Trump's campaign, attack him, say, my God, I can't wait for this campaign to be over. And, you know, Sean Spicer would, and of course they'll all deny it, but Sean Spicer was saying the guy was going to lose. And their only goal was to make sure he didn't lose by 8 or 9, because then they would lose the House and the Senate. But there was no way he was ever going to win. And by the way, I just called out those two names. Right. It was everybody up and down the line on the campaign, and everybody up and down the line in the White House. And when they deny it, they just prove themselves to be total liars.
So I can see how in some ways it's almost like for us, and especially for you, because you speak to so many White House insiders and national security, foreign policy leaders in office, that you're like, well, of course. But this is a dangerous precedent, that you have a group of people working, and especially after what we heard from Bob Woodward's book. So first, Mike Barnicle, as a newspaper guy, for the New York Times to take this step, and Willie's got the piece, which we're going to get to, but just what's your gut on it? What was your reaction when you read this?
I was stunned.
Yeah, that's me too.
I was absolutely stunned.
By what?
I was stunned, A, that they ran an anonymous op-ed piece. I was stunned, obviously, at the content of the piece and the descriptions of the ongoing crisis in the Oval Office.
Can we start with the first one? You were stunned that they ran the piece. Why were you stunned that they ran? Because this is obviously newsworthy. If they hadn't have run it, the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal.
Because of the anonymity, because of running it, you know, anonymously, you know, by an anonymous office. That's what stunned me. But the context of it is the crisis in the Oval Office. Where a sitting president, as John Meacham just explained, a sitting president of the United States, his behavior is described as erratic, ineffective, adversarial, and at least for me, my conclusion, my take on it was, I don't care who the author was. I would prefer that the author be named, he or she, obviously, but the larger context is, finally, people like Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell reading this, knowing what they know, knowing what so many around this presidency do know, is their larger obligation not to the country rather than to the party?
But they've known this all along, Willie. They've known that Donald Trump is not well. They've known everything that was in the Woodward book. They've seen firsthand. Everything that was in this anonymous article, they've heard firsthand for a year and a half now, and they've chosen to just smile and go along with him.
And by the way, many of them have said those things to us privately. We'll say them offset. We'll say them when you talk to their offices privately, that this is a White House. And it's something Senator Bob Corker said yesterday publicly. He said, yeah, this is exactly what I'm hearing from people off the record when I speak privately, which is that they have to work to contain this guy. If you have not yet read the op-ed, let's get into a bit of it. It's no surprise which article is the top trending piece of the New York Times right now. To recap the column that's shaken the White House this morning, a senior White House official writing anonymously claims to be part of the resistance on the inside. The official claims in the op-ed President Trump is amoral and that many senior administration officials are, quote, working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations. Meetings with him, the essay continues, veer off topic and off the rails. He engages in repetitive rants, and his impulsiveness results in half-baked, ill-informed, and occasionally reckless decisions that have to be walked back. The official goes on, Americans should know there are adults in the room. We fully recognize what is happening, and we're trying to do what's right, even when Donald Trump won't.
So let me ask you, Willie, is that, I guess, maybe that's the news?
Yes.
That there are adults in we've always known there, Mattis and others, we've always known there have been adults in the room, but is that the headline of this? Not that Donald Trump is unfit for office and that he's a danger to this country and to constitutional norms and our national security, but is the headline of this article the assurance that there are adults in the room that are working to contain him?
I think the headline for me is that the adults in the room are working to contain him by, as the article says, as the opinion piece says, by subverting his policies. So he puts something out, and they say we're actively working to push back against the president's policy initiatives. That's pretty extraordinary, and this person suggests that he or she is not alone in this effort, that there's a group of them on the inside. I am interested in who the person is.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think it's different if it's Jim Mattis. I'm not suggesting it's Jim Mattis, someone at his level, or a staffer at the National Economic Council, for example, something like that.
Well, and that's, Mike, what we heard from some former Clinton alumni, that based on their experiences, it could be a lower level staffer at the NEC. I do think that the New York Times owes a responsibility to its readers, and owed a responsibility to its readers before publishing this anonymous letter to give us a better understanding of the level of this person. One of his top advisors, a cabinet level official, a high-ranking official could be one of 1,000 people in the government.
Well, you wouldn't have had the piece in the paper. I mean, I'm sure the deal that was cut was, you've got to protect me. Whoever wrote it ought to step up now and claim authorship, because that's the next step here. But I mean, in answer to your initial question to Willie Joe, I mean, I think the root of this piece that everyone is reading is in this two sentences. The root of the problem is the president's amorality. Anyone who works with him knows he is not moored to any discernible first principles that guide his decision-making. This is a description of a sitting president of the United States.
And not surprising. By the way, the description the New York Times, just so we're clear, gives of the author is, quote, a senior official in the Trump administration. So that could be an awful lot of people. That doesn't say someone inside the White House. It says in the Trump administration. Let's go to the White House. NBC News national correspondent Peter Alexander is there. Peter, good morning. Take us inside the building yesterday. How the White House learned about this piece, how it's reacting, what it's doing to find out who the author is.
Yeah, Willie, it's clear that the White House was caught off guard by this op-ed. Literally, the moment it came out, It was flagged to me. I printed a copy of it and immediately ran upstairs inside the West Wing. And I went into Bill Shine, the top communications official to the president's office, and I handed him a copy of it and asked him if he had any response to this new anonymous op-ed. I asked him then if he'd seen it, and he said nope, and asked if he could read it for himself. So literally it appeared that was the first time that the White House was aware of it, was after it came out. And they were already reeling, as you know, from a series of other headlines, most notably the new details coming out of Bob Woodward's book, some reporting about from the Washington Post that they may be looking to a replacement from Jim Mattis, and then this that landed with a thud inside the West Wing. Based on our conversations with multiple aides and allies of the president, his reaction was, in their words, an eruption. They said he was, quote, volcanic. It was about an hour or so later that he was scheduled to be in the East Room, where he was going to be hosting some sheriffs from around the country. I was the pooler, which meant that I was going in to represent the TV groups. You see the back of my head right there. At the end of his remarks, I tried to pull him aside. As you can see, he was lured in when I brought up this. Initially, he said he didn't understand what I was talking about. Then I read the headline of it to him, saying that I am the resistance inside the Trump administration. And he appeared to know about it at that point. As you'll see, he pulled out some notes from his pocket. Here's the president's real-time reaction from yesterday afternoon.
We have somebody in what I call the failing New York Times that's talking about he's part of the resistance within the Trump administration.
This person
This
works
is what
for
we have to deal with. It's really a disgrace. I will say this. Nobody has done what this administration's done in terms of getting things passed and getting things through. So when you tell me about some anonymous source within the administration, probably who's failing and probably here for all the wrong reasons, no. And the New York Times is failing. If I weren't here, I believe the New York Times probably wouldn't even exist.
The president would tweet about this as well. Let me show you the tweet that he wrote, and I'm going to want to contrast that with what Sarah Sanders would later say as well. He said, does the so-called senior administration official really exist, or is it just the failing New York Times with another phony source? If the gutless anonymous person does indeed exist, the Times must, for national security purposes, turn him or her over to government at once. He also wrote, as you see, treason, question mark. It was notable, though, what the president said, where he questioned that this person even existed, because Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, in a statement only moments before that, had effectively said they believe this exists by saying this coward needs to resign immediately. The bottom line here, inside this West Wing, this is a place, as we have witnessed, that is already filled with mistrust. The president describing this, in effect, as a treasonous act of disloyalty. But as some described it last night, this is like those horror movies when you get the phone call and you find out that the bad guy is inside the house. This was first reported by the Washington Post. A source told similar language to me last night. The bottom line right now is nobody knows who to trust, and it's only getting worse.
Yeah, could be the whole house except for Javanka. Peter Alexander, thank you very, very, very much for getting up early.
John Meacham, have we ever been here before? Is the closest we've come to this, would it be Woodrow Wilson? Where are we here?
Well, in terms of disability, Wilson's stroke in the last year and a half or so of his term, which had incredibly important effects on the life of the nation. It was covered up. His wife, Edith Wilson, his second wife, effectively ran the government. We had some questions about disability, episodic disability with Franklin Roosevelt at the very end of his term, particularly at Yalta. We see photographs now, and it's extraordinary that he got through it. Eisenhower had his 2 heart attacks in the 1950s, all of which led to the creation of, and the passage in 1965 to 66 to 67 of the 25th Amendment, which I'm sure we'll get to, which is a weapon on the table. Let me say one thing about the author here, as we inevitably try to guess, and rightly so, who did it. Henry Adams wrote a novel, Democracy, about Washington in the 19th century that was not published anonymous. Of course, Joe Klein did Primary Colors. Here's something that I think is particularly important about who this author is. And Willie was just talking about the process of it. it would be fascinating to know exactly when the conversations with the New York Times and the author or the author's representatives began, because this reads to me as though there are really two elements to it. One is about Donald Trump, but the other is, hey, we're trying. And it's a defense of the people who are publicly associated with the administration. And I can't help but believe that the death of John McCain a week ago Saturday, and the encomiums that poured out, the eulogies about someone who put country first, who stood up to Donald Trump, did not have some atmospheric effect here. I don't know this, and so this is purely speculative. I stipulate that. But this reads to me like it was written by someone who was either in the National Cathedral or watching it and thinking, what are they going to say about me?
I think, and Mike, you're agreeing with that. I think we all, talking to each other on that day, said that this is a moment in time, and this is something that's going to have an impact. And I think we're seeing part of that impact now.
Yeah, my understanding is that this piece, the Times has had this piece for several days, negotiating various elements of the piece, whether it would be run anonymously, but they've had it for several days. I agree with John Meacham. I think they've had it in hand, you know, prior to the release of the excerpts from Bob Woodward's book, and maybe prior to last weekend.
So a couple of notes on what the president had said, and we've been talking about who the person is. First of all, New York Times talking about how horrible the New York Times is failing. The New York Times are enjoying glory days. Yes. Their glory days of the 21st century. You look at all the numbers. It's Washington Post revived, doing about as well as anybody could imagine. It's extraordinary, the turnaround at the Washington Post. Also, this is interesting. When we talk, Willie, and we were talking about before who this person was. If you take everything at face value, they are a Republican. They support the tax cuts. They support the regulatory reform, support the judicial nominees. But it's very interesting. One of the tells also is that they brought up John McCain. Now, the tribe from which I came, if you were trying to prove your bona fides, you would talk about what a great, honorable man John McCain was. But you would not bring him into the political discussion. If you were a military man or woman, you would do that.
Right.
But not if you grew up in movement conservatism, because John McCain was another part of that tribe. And so it's very interesting, the combination of a person saying I'm a Republican, I love the tax cuts, I love the regulatory reform, I love the judicial nominees, but then bringing in John McCain beyond the service aspect of John McCain and what a hero he was, maybe suggests, to me at least, if there is a tell, and if you can take everything at face value, that this is a Republican, but it's a Republican, let's just say from the military, sort of military faction of the Trump administration.
And there's a big focus in this on national security and foreign policy, to further your argument a little bit. But it definitely is a conservative. I mean, there's an entire graph here about the president showing little affinity for ideals long espoused by conservatives, free minds, free markets, free bets, talking about how he attacks those things every day, saying this guy's not one of us, effectively. I guess the question for me is, does this piece, as an American, make you feel better or worse? Better that there are people on the inside pushing back? Or worse, when you put this together with Bob Woodward's book about what's actually happening every day inside the West Wing of the White House?
I think it's both. I mean, it's heartening to know that what we see coming out of the president's mouth is not just being swallowed by the people who work for him and they're running off and doing what he says, because we know that he's not necessarily consistent and at times extremely divisive and cruel in his language and in his tweets. But we're watching, we talk to people on the inside, and we have seen them now for quite some time being visibly uncomfortable with this president and talking quietly. Now, and I think inspired by John McCain's legacy and his funeral. People are becoming openly hostile toward this president. They are showing that they are not following his orders. They're hiding things from him. While that might be helpful given how disappointing this president is, I think it sets an incredibly dangerous precedent for the presidency itself in the United States of America.
And John, perhaps the most dangerous precedent is you have military leaders ignoring the recommendations of the civilian head of the armed forces. Even if it is an illegal order, it is one thing for the President of the United States to say, assassinate Assad, and then Mattis to say okay, and then hang up the phone and ignore him. It's another thing to go over there and say, Mr. President, you can't do that. That's illegal. And this would happen and that would happen. It seems that you have people that are just brushing his orders aside. And while we celebrate that in the age of Trump, it sets a very dangerous precedent for, let's say, the 46th president or 47th president who tells a military leader, don't assassinate the leader. Don't cross that boundary. Don't fire that missile.
Exactly. That's a great point. And as we've said before, we know that the presidency has not changed Donald Trump. The question is, to what extent has he changed the presidency? And the chain of command and the civilian military control of our projections of force is a huge part of this. Now, it is true that Henry Kissinger spent most of his time, and Bob Haldeman spent most of his time, ignoring late-night orders from Richard Nixon, like go bomb Brookings, or let's go.
There is that.
Take out Cronkite's boat on the Vineyard. Let the frogmen go to Nantucket. There were these things, and in fact, there's a great theory about. There's a great theory about Watergate that, in fact, somebody just screwed up and actually did what he might have said.
Did what he told them to do when he was drinking. Never, the tickler file. So never do that. The next morning, Nixon is like, "You broke into what?"
I told you. No. I meant, I was just kidding. So there's the madman theory there. So we can sort of chuckle about it. But we've all heard this off the air, and I think that given the stakes, it's safe to repeat. It is pretty clear to me from people who are in a position to know that there has been a shift in the presidential chain of command on military orders in a way that is reminiscent of what Jim Slazinger did in 1974. And if you talk to sober-minded lawmakers and you say in a concerned voice, I'm just really worried this guy might try to do something in a wag the dog way, they will say, well, let me tell you, the reason I sleep at night is I know that's not going to happen. Now, that means, I think that the Secretary of Defense has assured everyone that there are checks and balances in place. You're right, though. That's reassuring today, might not be so reassuring tomorrow.
Correct.
We are all Al Haig now.
Exactly. I'm in charge.
If you check the chain of command.
All right, still ahead on Morning. By the way, Trump denied the Assad claims. Still ahead on Morning Joe, we'll be joined by former Secretary of State John Kerry, former CIA Director John Brennan, and independent Senator Angus King.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.